what are you looking at lately in the markets and as that relates to Bitcoin and crypto?
Yeah, so I mean, the markets are still kind of watching every headline coming out from Russia and Ukraine, right? Friday we saw that gap up initially, or I think it was Friday, and the markets had gapped up after supposedly Putin had said something positive about maybe negotiations, and then I think it was very interesting to see how the market, after just a little bit, I mean, very limited upside, it opened up and then right away started to sell as people said, listen, this guy isn't some guy that you can trust in what he says, and there's no troop movements to signal any pullback. So the market really sold very sharply, closed at the lows of the day, which is not unusual for a Friday when the markets are closed for 2 straight days. So people don't want to be buying into Friday when you have a war that could, I mean, God forbid, could escalate and draw in more countries or NATO. I mean, there's just so many risks right now that it makes it very tough to be someone who's just accumulating. I vividly remember how many, I mean, in the last prior to this year, 2022, but, going back to late 2020 and 2021, I mean, there would be news that would hit that you'd be like, that's not good news. And then the markets would sell for like an hour and then boom, off to the races they would go. And you're right, way different market environment. The psychology of the market is 100% different.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is behaving kind of just like the chart signals it should. Everyone's always saying, well, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, that should help it. But the bottom line is the chart is the chart, right? And we know charts have a powerful essence to them. And essentially what you have here on the chart is a lot of choppy action from this bigger move down. So again, this is what we call a megaphone pattern. These two lines are slightly widening. You could also just call it a bear flag, if you will, but you can just see how you're just going up and down like this inside of this range. Now, if you look at 1,000 of these patterns, right, you'll see that a majority, and again, that 60%, 70, 80%, something in that range, of eventually what ends up happening is you'll see, pops and then eventually a breakdown to the downside. So again, as of now, as long as you stay within this pattern, this is a midterm bearish signal. It doesn't mean it's going to break down tomorrow or even next week, but inevitably, if you continue chopping sideways, we refer to it in the technical analysis world as bearish consolidation. So, again, I love it long term, and you can play lots of short-term moves inside of this range, but you should all, at least for me, I'm expecting it to drop significantly more. I still have a price target sub 20,000 or just sub 20,000. I think that's the biggest thing is, a lot of people are saying, well, basically you have this verse 1 versus 2 scenario, right? Where, Bitcoin has never gone and touched a previous pivot high. So the idea that it would get down to 20,000 is kind of crazy to a lot of Bitcoiners because that would be the first time it ever did that. But then you have the other side, which is, well, if you're entering a bear market or a crypto winter, well, then you have 80 to 85% declines historically. And then that puts it way below 20,000. So, one of these scenarios is going to be right. One of them is going to be wrong. I happen to be in your camp. And that was, by the way, a great point. I actually was doing that analysis this weekend, where if you look at this here, you have basically a parallel channel here, right? So pivot point, and then it broke above and retested there. And you have pivot point, pivot point, pivot point. So notice how that channel is downsloping. This channel is kind of upsloping. And you're right, downsloping channels have a much bigger propensity to break up like this one did, versus slightly upsloping chop is a bigger propensity to break down. So again, they're very minor details here that most investors wouldn't see. But when you really look at these charts closely, there is differences here, and investors need to understand the probabilities that come off of that.
The Bitcoin is less liquid now. I think there's less inventory on exchanges than really ever. But of course, that's, whales and large investors moving stuff in and out, which, that can change in an instant with, Bitcoin moving on and off exchanges. But a couple of interesting things coming up next week are, the Terra Luna network is, they're making a $1.5 billion purchase. But, that is going to happen off exchange. So that I don't think will directly impact pricing because that's just not going to happen on exchanges. That's going to be, over the counter deal there. And then, of course, you have the El Salvador Bitcoin bond. I don't know that affects directly because they're raising money to then go buy Bitcoin. But eventually, and he's using the exchanges to buy his Bitcoin. So you have that happening. And then the other interesting rumor that's circulating is that there are some individuals through Switzerland trying to offload, $6 billion to $10 billion worth of crypto. Now,
Wow.
non-specific asset, but obviously the speculation is it's Russian oligarchs trying to, get their money out. But there's rumors out there, and nobody's verified anything, but there are some Swiss banks and Swiss investment managers that are trying to help people unwind some big crypto positions.
Yeah, and the liquidity issue that you mentioned is important because you could say, okay, well, that means more people are holding their Bitcoin versus having it on exchanges, which is a positive maybe for the longer term. But when something's less liquid, it doesn't take much of a sell to cause a big drop. And then again, that could be what ends up happening, where we just see a 1 week flush down sub 20,000, and then maybe at that point it ends. I don't know, but definitely the chart's signaling that at this point. And it's interesting with the liquidity and how little is on the exchanges.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my thesis about prices, all we know is what we have in front of us. March 2020, Bitcoin went down to $4,500 when the world was shutting down economically. So that was a panic sell. We haven't seen that panic capitulation yet on this side of the downtrend. That's the last time we saw one. That is equivalent to the March 2008-9 capitulation we saw in the stock markets. So we know where price can go because it did last time, and that was only a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And we also know price went to 69,000. So for me, as an investor, I know my downside is 4,500. I know my upside is 69,000. So I make my decisions in that range, but so much more attention on the space now, and a lot more people that would potentially jump in at 30 grand, but to prop the price up at 30,000 and kind of keep it there. But World War III breaks out and, things look just really scary. We see what happens in those environments.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the big differences that Bitcoin hasn't experienced really is that, since its inception in 2009, this is the first time that we've seen significant inflation where the Fed can't necessarily go right back to printing money, right? Which is, you could argue that was the base case for why Bitcoin was needed, right? Now, if you stop that printing press, at least for a short amount of time, it's kind of a new scenario for Bitcoin. And again, to me, that could be a reason also to see further downside, just like in tech stocks. And I think one of the big things you brought up, which is something that I watch for, is that psychological indicator, right? So if you go back to like 2018, 2019, I still remember it vividly. And this is where I started to get bullish on Bitcoin back then, when we were in that 5,000-ish range, is when, CNBC had just had the ticker on their lower thing, like constantly 2017, all the way into early 2018. And kind of, I think it was late 2018 or early 2019, it kind of just vanished, right? And they didn't talk about it much at all. It almost never came up. And at that point, there was so much bearishness. Will Bitcoin survive and all these things? And then it's like, that is the time to buy. And everyone, I mean, on Twitter, I see it. Everyone's like, oh, if Bitcoin goes to 20,000, I'm going to buy everything. I'll sell a kidney, even someone said, right? And the essence of it is if wherever the bottom is, people, the general nature is to make people so scared that they don't buy it there, right? That's when the bottom is there, right?
Yeah. So what is it going to take to get Bitcoin back to 69 and up to that $100,000 level? Because I can see $100,000. I don't see beyond that right now because there's just too much risk and too much downside. What will it take to get it back up to that $69,000 to $100,000 level?
Yeah. So for me, on a technical basis, this orange trend line would be something that if we started trading above here, and I don't just mean piercing, because you could see over here it pierced briefly. You could even argue that it closed one day above and then reversed back down. But if you started really trading above this area, then at least I would say it's going back to this point here around 52,000, or the midpoint of this channel. That would be the beginnings of something that I'd pay attention to. And then obviously, if we start trading up, I think people start jumping back in. There's that momentum trade that would kick back in at a certain price when you start to get closer, and eventually you would get through that. The regulation last week that was brought out is super, super positive. It's not a negative for crypto, and it's that on that track of what I've said for a long time, which is you need regulation in the space to get bigger adoption. Meaning that if you want pension funds and you want more institutional money, and you want the 80-year-old that has $50 million to actually invest some in crypto, you need to see things that are setting up to make it safer for those investors, right? They're risk adverse people. They have so much money, they don't need to take risk. They want kind of safe trades. And that would be something that I would watch for. So more regulation on the positive side. And I think it's important, you look at what China has done over the last couple of years, and a lot of people don't remember this, but when they kind of went on the offensive to get rid of Bitcoin and purge it and get it out of the system, to me, that was one of the best things that they could have done for the US in terms of adopting it, because you basically created this new hub of mining taking place in Texas and these other areas in the US, which is now employing a lot of people, and there's a lot of money tied up in it, right? And then we've seen Microsoft go out and buy Activision Blizzard, I think it was, and just this adoption in that way. And that's huge, because it basically will keep the government from cracking down in a bad way on cryptocurrency. So longer term, that's huge. It doesn't necessarily tell you it's going right back to 100,000 or 69,000 at this point, but those type of things have been very positive for US adoption and being okay with it on that regulatory side. People, a lot of crypto traders, they've never, this is what's crazy about it. Crypto is such a short period of time. In addition, a lot of these traders have been here for the last 2 years or 3 years. They've never experienced a tightening phase by the Federal Reserve or even inflation whatsoever, really, aside from the sub 2%. And so this is a whole new ball game. So a lot of people that'll tell you like, oh, it'll never do that because it didn't do this before. People have to realize you're entering a new phase that crypto has never experienced.